Now, everybody knows for the last few years that Fukushima has been an absolute disaster. And things are still going wrong there. Now, there have been a lot of reports about, there have been a lot of recent reports out about how a lot of the engineers and people who are fixing or trying to clean up the area in Fukushima and just prevent the core from melting down even further have been dumping, toxic wastewater into the ocean. Not only that, but there's been storage tank leaks that have been leaking into the groundwater. Now, this particular story actually comes from a worker who had actually worked on some of these storage tanks. A little bit of insider information from a former employee. Now, this employee was named, and forgive me if I butcher it, Yoshitatsu Uichi. Now, he is an auto mechanic and tour bus driver. Now, he worked at Fukushima between July 2nd and December 6th of 2012. Now, he talked to the paper Asahi Shimbun. And once again, I'm sorry for any viewers that know Japanese. I apologize for butchering the names. I do not know Japanese. Now, Uichi, he was one of 17 workers that was actually sent from Okinawa to actually work on the storage tanks at Fukushima. Now, these storage tanks, of course, were to store this contaminated water so it didn't get into the groundwater, didn't get into the ground, or have to get dumped back into the ocean, which a lot of it eventually did. I think it was over 300 million gallons of just toxic, contaminated, radioactive water getting dumped into the ocean. It's kind of a bad thing. Now, these storage tanks, according to Uichi, were actually held together with very cheap materials. Now, his task was to cover 5 of these storage tanks with lids. Okay, well, what kind of lids? Well, they were supposed to be steel lids, and according to Uichi, he said that his instructions were to only use 4 bolts. But the lids had 8 bolt holes. Okay, so you're not exactly sealing this thing to the best of your ability. And that's definitely trying to cut costs. Now, I think you can get away with some of that for lids. Okay. But there are other things that they can't really get away with. And I'll get into that. Now, what did Uichi have to think about this? Well, he said, quote, "I couldn't believe that such slipshod work was being done, even if it was part of stopgap measures." Absolutely. Now, some of the other things that he had pointed out is that wire nets were used instead of reinforcing bars. So instead of using bars to help construct these storage tanks, they used wire nets. Wire nets. Not only that, but instead of using a sealing agent on these cylindrical tanks, they used waterproof sheets on the inside. Is it any surprise that any of this stuff was found to be leaking? Is that any surprise that so many of these storage tanks are now leaking the radioactive water into the ground? Not at all. Look, Fukushima has been a disaster. I mean, obviously it was a disaster when it happened, but it's still a disaster because of the ineptness of first TEPCO, who owned the plant, and now the Japanese government that nationalized the plant. There have been fuck-ups on every count. First of all, with the design and the placement of the generators during the earthquake and the tsunami. That's a fuck-up right there. Sure, nobody expects to get slammed with both an earthquake and a tsunami at the same time, but you really kind of have to plan for things a little bit better. Plan for basically the unthinkable, just in case, because things do happen, and Fukushima should be a teachable moment to say that, hey, it may be improbable, but it does happen. Stuff like that does happen. along with TEPCO's ineptness and the Japanese government's ineptness at handling this thing, you've also had a lot of violations, like safety violations, especially in stuff like this, trying to construct the storage tanks out of cheap materials. Now, a researcher named Christina Consolo, she hosts a radio show called Newt Radio. She says, quote, "The site has been propped up with duct tape and a kickstand for over 2 years. Many of their fixes are only temporary, as there are so many issues to address. And cost always seems to be an enormous factor in what gets implemented and what doesn't." And there you really have it. It's cost. Now, it costs too much to fix this stuff, well enough to hold this contaminated water. It costs too much. I don't want to spend that kind of money. And there have been other reports, of course, of homeless people being hired at less than minimum wage through criminal gangs to work at Fukushima. Oh, for Christ's sakes. If that's not exploiting the homeless to save a few bucks, I don't know what is. So they try to do these cheap fixes to save a few bucks. And cheap labor, going through many subsidiaries, of course, in order to, hide any or protect yourself from any wrongdoing, and employing gangs to go and round up homeless people to work for less than minimum wage at your plant. Why is this not a bigger story? Why isn't a lot of the Western media, the other media, covering this stuff? I feel like there's not a lot of television outlets, especially, that are covering what's going on at Fukushima. Now, I could be wrong. I don't have all day to sit there and watch TV. So I could be wrong. But this should be a bigger story. This should be a much, much bigger story than it is. And I'm not sure why it isn't. There's also other parts of where the Japanese government has signed in new restrictions on speech to try and silence people from talking about how bad the Fukushima disaster is. That's pretty bad. That's really, really bad. And that's really dangerous, because it's really important to know what kind of damage and what kind of danger regular people will face from this disaster, because this disaster is not over. This is an ongoing disaster. This is an ongoing problem, and it will continue to be an ongoing problem. Radiation doesn't just go away. It stays for hundreds of years. And so the least the Japanese government could do is try to humor us and actually give us the real information. And try to tell us, hey, yeah, this is what's really happening. We fucked up in about 100 different ways. But really, guys, we're working on it. I would like to see them actually start to do better. Because I think that it's the right thing to do. The story gets me mad. The story gets me really mad. And it should get everybody mad.